The research lab at the GSD, which is staffed by graduate students and myself, considers that a just city is where all people and communities, but especially the least not included, have access to networks and environments that offer the opportunities and resources to be productive and prosperous, advancing their social and economic mobility and agency. We believe that the just city is really unique to place and that there is not one frame or paradigm or universal notion of what makes a just city. The ability for us to collaborate and think about a more nuanced language of describing the conditions of injustice, but the aspiration for justice is what led us to create the Just City Index. We've used this and other tools as a part of the work that we've done, and there are a number of publications that we've worked on to begin to talk about how issues of injustice and justice show up, whether that's through the public realm, whether that's through our discipline of architecture, whether that's through looking at legacy cities, these cities that have lost a significant amount of their population. So through my practice, this notion of something called just urbanism is at the core of how we work with cities, and that we imagine the solutions we're after to be restorative, but it's sometimes to really get at a different outcome steeped in conditions of injustice, we've got to be disruptive. Perhaps we'll be more if we're value-based, we'll come up with different outcomes that allow us to work across difference through cultural competency, across disciplines, that's valuing what we call community expertise, working at the grassroots with grass tops leaders, that it has to inherently be political in order to be disruptive, and that we actually hold ourselves accountable to these changes. So I'll end very quickly with a project that I'm working on currently with an organization in Chicago, newly formed, called the Emerald South Economic Development Collaborative. And this is an organization that was formed to work alongside of the University of Chicago, the Obama Foundation and the new Obama Presidential Center located on the south side of Chicago, and the city and a whole host of community organizations to figure out how to leverage the presence of those anchor institutions to seed, define, and fuel a new approach to economic development for this predominantly African-American set of neighborhoods on the south side of Chicago that would realize a different outcome that would allow residents and businesses to fully participate in the economic upside of growth. So when we begin to think about what could a new future economy look like, it's important again to think about how do we help businesses, families, households withstand the shocks of the pandemic, of economic collapse, of environmental change in different ways. And for us, that means an economic development strategy that is more than just about housing and real estate investment, but it has to be about closing racial wealth gaps. For example, in Chicago, a home owned in a Black neighborhood, when compared to an identical type of home in a white neighborhood, is devalued or appraised at over $36,000 less. The income gap of households in this part of town are making almost half that of the Chicago average. And when we're beginning to look at both the combination of public and private investment that are happening in Black communities, we find that both on the public and private side, that there is insufficient investment happening in these neighborhoods. So we've begun to map up what we call an inclusive economy strategy centered around these 8 prongs. We first believe that we have to think about investments that are near-term and reparative. How do we begin to reappraise and correct for the value of homes in Black neighborhoods and deepen land ownership, home ownership, but also business ownership? How do we build a vision for economic growth and lean into the assets of the neighborhood such that we can begin to be a capital attractor for both public, private, and mission-driven investments? We have a set of strategies that are aimed at restorative inclusive practices of economic development. There are a number of different cultural, economic, healthcare, and institutional assets in these neighborhoods, and a lot of them are Black producers. How are we leaning into the cultural heritage of this neighborhood, which was once the Harlem of Chicago, to monetize these cultural assets, again, to deepen equity ownership in neighborhoods? This neighborhood is also centered by 850 acres of historic parkland designed by Olmsted. And several of these parks are experiencing a number of different environmental and climate change challenges, the loss of trees, for example, chronic flooding. This is an opportunity to repair and restore these historic parks through new mechanisms of blue and green infrastructure. And then on the people side, this is also an opportunity for us to think about restorative practice as it relates to correcting for the Black-white wage gap by investing in workforce and entrepreneurship. And then finally, we think about resiliency as not only an environmental proposition, but really an economic resiliency proposition. Again, to make sure that our community households and businesses can withstand some of the shocks that we just experienced and we're still digging ourselves out of in 2020. So how do we think about that now economy, which is tied to filling the retail spending gap, but our next economy, anchored by the University of Chicago. Chicago is becoming one of the nation's federal deep technology hubs, which is around healthcare and quantum computing, and is already seeing $1.2 billion investment. This is going to give us an opportunity to leverage the anchor institutions to attract industry in the hopes of creating a more diversified set of businesses, entrepreneurs, jobs, and wages that help backfill for the closing of the steel mill, but then to also leverage that in a way to create a more efficient business-to-business model for joint ventures, partnerships, contracting, and procurement with local businesses. And there are already a number of both workforce, entrepreneurship, and business collaboratives underway as a part of the construction of the Obama Presidential Center.